Okay, so I've been talking about feedback in a couple of the different topics in this video. I just want to anchor in this a little bit. So, feedback is critical because feedback is one of the critical elements of providing support. And as an effective leader, we we provide direction to our team and we provide support. And if we want the team to be high performers, we need to make sure that those two things are provided from a team perspective. So providing feedback is critical in terms of getting the best out of people, in terms of keeping them motivated, in terms of giving them good information that they can work well to. If we want to be able to meet, have our team members meet their expectations and be able to achieve their scope of responsibility and accountability, we need to be prepared to be able to give feedback and do it in a way in which that it's valuable to them. So we can support our teams by clarifying goals, value the work, expectations, resources required, L&D opportunities, positive behaviors, and asking what we can do for them. And we can do that through either formal feedback or informal feedback. So formal feedback are things such as our performance cycles that I talked about earlier when I talked about performance plans. Where we set a meeting, we we um, we set goals, we share goals, and we set goals. We have a midpoint review process. We evaluate and we make adjustments as required. We have a final uh, evaluation as part of the cycle. We sometimes give a formal rating, and then that goes on to things such as um, uh, remuneration reviews and bonuses and incentives and so forth. Formal feedback can also be performance management processes where we sit down with individuals and provide support in terms of how gaps in performance can be improved, and we document those and we work to those. We come back and review them and so forth. Formal feedback can also be things such as quality meetings where we might have discussions with team members or sometimes with suppliers or external stakeholders on on um, on performance issues and make recommendations and problem solve together and so forth. Formal feedback can also be things like commendations where we make recommendations up the organization in terms of recognition and bonuses and awards or certificates and so forth. Usually, anything that's recorded, documented, and goes into the file would be considered uh, formal feedback. On the flip side of that, informal feedback is the stuff that's a little bit more spontaneous. It's not necessarily recorded, although I always recommend that as a manager you keep a diary of when you give informal feedback. It's always great when you're having uh, formal discussions to be able to be specific and say, I've got like I can think of 12 times in the last 3 months where I've thanked you for doing something. And if you can be quite specific about, such as this and this and this and this, that can be really powerful in those formal discussions. But generally speaking, informal feedback is stuff that's spontaneous, it's not recorded or documented, and it's done in a timely manner. So, right there and there, or close to it when something happens. So, things like, you know, meetings where you might just give someone a shout out in the team meeting, or where you might have a daily catch up and you just say to someone, look, I really appreciate that you've done this. That's really terrific. Or I need you to have a look at this. I don't think we quite hit the mark on that. This is what we were supposed to do, and this is the gap. Where you might have discussions like that, which are generally uh, on the run or spontaneous or not necessarily documented. We would classify any of that as informal feedback. As part of the feedback process, I just want to talk about how to give um, good corrective or constructive feedback. So I know sometimes people get a bit tied up in the language and go, oh, it's negative feedback. I don't know why we call it constructive feedback, and and um, and I always like to clarify that it is constructive feedback because if you're giving someone just negative feedback, you're adding no value to it. All you're doing is that you're rewarding yourself. So when when I just tell my kids off, it's not doing anything other than to make me feel good and to alleviate my frustration. It doesn't tell them about how they can do it better or what they should have been doing. Or when I just sit there and have a rant at them, it's really just about making me feel good by getting something off my chest. And if I do that in the workplace, it's got absolutely no value other than it's going to upset my employees and probably increase my rate of absenteeism and turnover and uh, produce a gap between the connection between me and the team because I'm not actually giving anything of value or benefit other than making myself feel good about expressing the frustration that I feel. Now, that's important, and we do feel frustrated. But as managers and leaders, sometimes we've got a responsibility to control that, and it's to you got to you know go into the office, close the door, and punch the punching bag if that makes it feel better. But when we actually sit down and provide feedback, if we don't have anything constructive to say, we should probably have a better think about it before we open our mouth. And this is to say that as leaders and as managers, we should be providing feedback that helps people to grow or to be able to do their job better. So, this is the idea of constructive, and that's why I like to use the terminology constructive. It doesn't mean that you don't identify where there's been a gap or a shortfall. That's definitely part of it, but it means that you have to then be able to provide some type of support and guidance on what should be done in the future. So things such as, we've got to, obviously when we give them constructive feedback, we've got to respect people's privacy, make sure those discussions behind closed doors or somewhere where they're not necessarily going to be heard by others. We've got to focus on the problem, not the person. So we're going to say, this is the issue. This is what needed to be done. This is what happened. This is the gap. Not, Tony, you're useless. You always stuff this up. Why can't you do this? Now that's a very personalized statement and it's attacking the individual. It's a very judgy kind of statement. Whereas the first one gets us to focus on what the issue is. Now, the individual may still take it personally. We can't control that. But by the language that we're using, we're trying to guide them to think about it as an issue of work performance, not an issue of the individual. So we're describing behaviors, not necessarily personalities. We're saying, this is what needed to be done. This is what I observed you to do, or this is what the records show, or whatever the case may be. And then, for me, my personal style then is uh, to not only identify what the problem is, but then to ask for information. So say, okay, this is the issue, this is the problem, this is how this is causing a problem, this is the gap in performance. Why did this happen? Can you shed any light on it, or are you able to, share with me why this happened? So, and this is simply because one of my key personal rules is Stephen Covey's seek to understand before being understood. And that's always try and understand the other person's perspective before I want to share mine, which I think is a really good one, by the way. Um, so I always ask, okay, what happened here? And then say, okay, I understand. I understand the message that you give me. I understand the emotion behind it. But we have to, back to the problem, this is what we need to do. We need to achieve, this is the standard, or this is the performance requirement. How are we going to do that? And this is where we're now starting to focus on the constructive part. What are you going to do? And then what can I do to help you? And this is where we're both working together. So we can ask a person's help in resolving that. How you phrase that will depend on your own personal style and the team member that you're involved, where you are in the discussion process, whether you're at the start of the discussion or whether you've already had this discussion a couple of times and you're now starting to get a little bit more pointed. But this is really what you're doing. You're trying to understand, identifying any potential barriers, and clarifying exactly what we need to achieve and why that's important, and then working together to resolve it. And people like Ken Blanchard talk about this service leadership, where our role as leaders in a contemporary society, maybe not in the 1900s, in the early 1900s, maybe not in the 1950s, maybe not even in the 19,000s or 1900s and 80s and 90s and whatnot, but in the year 2021 and beyond, with social norms and expectations, the type of leadership that many workplaces are looking for is what's called service leadership, where we look at our teams and we say, what can I do to help you to do your job best? So, part of that, if I go back to the previous content, is to say, you've got responsibilities. What are you going to do? But then I've got responsibilities as your leader and manager. What can I do to help you? That might be more training, might be a review of tools, it might be a review of process, it might be a review of support colleagues and so forth. We can look at all these things together to come up with a plan of attack. And that's where we reach agreement on specific actions and what each individual will do. And then we'll talk about how we're going to follow this up. How will we review it to see if these actions are going to be are on target and if they're getting the outcomes that we expected. So what's going to be our follow-up? And then we always make sure that we're clear about what the next steps are. So this is, if we get this right, that's great. And you can really leave the person motivated by saying, if we get this right, we're going to have some, terrific outcomes, or we're going to be able to please this client, or we're going to do an exceptional job on this project. But you can also say, if we don't get it right, we're going to have to continue down this path. And as we get down this path, we need to have someone in this role who can do this. When you get to the pointy end, that's where the discussions start to get to that point. But at this stage, when we're talking about early on in the discussion, we're really just making sure that we're focusing on what the issue is, but we're being constructive in what we're doing. So we should never use feedback as a punishment. We should always try to leave the person motivated and believing that they can do better. These two things are really important. One, that they understand and they think it's important, but then that they believe that they can do it. So, that we're providing as much support as possible to say, it's really achievable. And you'll hear this often, especially in leadership circles, about, the feedback sandwich. I prefer a hamburger myself personally, where the bread is the positive feedback and all the meat and the filling. I think this is a veggie patty actually. All the protein and the filling in the middle is the constructive stuff. So you want to say, focus on some positive things to begin with. As work, observing you do this particular task, you did point 1, 2, and 3 really well. I noticed that 4 was a little bit off the process. The process is supposed to be this. I observed you do this. I was wondering why that is. Can you share with me why you did it the way you did it? Okay, I can see why that's I can see why you did that. However, we still need to do it as per the process. Is there a problem with you being able to do that? Do you think that there's, okay, what can I do to assist you with it? Is there anything that we can do together to get it resolved? Okay, great. You do this, I'll do this. Let's come back in a couple of days. Let's see how that's going, or I'll come back and I can observe you doing it again tomorrow, whatever the case may be. So that's the filling in the middle, and then we end up on a positive. Okay, that's great. Look, I just want to reiterate, you did steps 1, 2, and 3 really, really well. Really happy with that. I reckon if you can nail down these things that we talked about for 4, and you can get that right, you're going to be able to follow the process from start to go perfectly, and you're going to, really get this task smashed out. So again, we're leaving on that positive again, and the idea is that we're leaving the individual not only thinking that it's important, but believing that they can do it and motivated to do it. And again, and I say this throughout the whole of the management series, but you have to be authentic and genuine about this. For me, I like to assume that if I'm not genuine and authentic, I always assume that people will see through that. So that makes sure that, if I'm going to give someone positive feedback, I have to stop and think about what is it that I'm going to say, and is it genuine? Because I don't want to give someone just lip service, say, oh, it's great that you showed up to work today, because that's just a passive aggressive statement, and that's got absolutely no value to anybody. So I have to be quite genuine and making sure that the positive feedback that I give as I'm leading into this discussion is genuine, and it's genuinely felt, that I really do appreciate what they've done, because I understand the value to the team and also to my own performance when they do that task in that particular way. and so forth. And that's the idea of making sure that you're genuine and you do think about it, and it's a meaningful discussion. So when providing positive feedback, make sure we do it as soon as practical. Make sure we're specific so the person knows that it's what we're talking about and that it's genuine and genuinely appreciated. Don't give any caveats with it, So don't say, "Oh, this is really good, but it would have been better if," or something like that, because that'll just sabotage the whole message. If you want to make it public, so if you want to share it at the next team meeting, ask for their approval to do that. Seek their permission, uh, and link it back wherever you can. Link it back to, and this goes back with being genuine. Link it back to how it helps you and the team, uh, and of course, as I've said earlier, wherever possible, we want to reward positive behavior. And so we've had a constructive discussion, and Tony has gone through and now has done step 4 really well. In the follow up, I review it, and it looks, it's a perfect process. I want to give genuine positive feedback. Say, look, really appreciate this. It really has. It's an important part of the team process, and it has these positive flows down the supply chain or whatever the case may be, down the pipeline. And then I want to reward that. Now, in saying thank you and being able to genuinely talk about how it benefits the team, that in itself is a positive reward, and that's an intrinsic positive reward, something that's not necessarily tangible, but it's genuine and it's close to the heart. But intrinsic rewards can also be things like a thank you note, or a pat in the back, a genuine pat in the back, or just a genuine statement of appreciation. But we can also do extrinsic stuff depending on the type of organization and what your slush fund is like and so forth. But things like bonuses, cash, shares, entitlement, prizes and gifts, hampers, gift cards, tickets to the movies, plaques with people's names on it, or team-based rewards like morning teas, lunches, and barbecues, which are always great and have multiple benefits. Are really good. So you can think about reward systems as extrinsic and intrinsic. And I'm not going to talk about B.F. Skinner's pigeons, but there's plenty of research, both scientific and anecdotal, that positive positive rewards, or rewards both intrinsic and extrinsic, um, do increase the likelihood of behaviors being replicated. So if you see something positive, if you see something good and you give it positive feedback, you increase the likelihood of that person doing that good thing again. And of course, on the flip side of that is that sometimes you will have to deal with challenging situations. And we'll talk more about conflict in a different unit and a different topic, but in the context of providing feedback and giving constructive feedback, there will be situations where there will be some degree of conflict, particularly around challenges, and that could be between you and the team, or be amongst the team themselves. And I suppose just make a couple of points around that. How that manifests and it um, how it comes into it comes out in behaviors in the team will be dependent on the culture of the organization, the code of behaviors that you've instilled within your team, and the systems for which problems are raised and issues and and people are consulted and so forth. That all the things that we've talked about, that goes without saying. So things like having a culture of openness and honesty, support and trust, respect, good sound making decisions and so forth, procedures, and good relationships both internally and intra and intergroup relationships. Um, and having a good dispute resolution process, having regular meetings, having roundtable discussions, genuine open door policies and suggestions and whiteboards and all those type of things are really important in terms of dealing with challenges. Um, and they're things that I've been talking about indirectly through this particular series for this topic and unit. But I just want to come back to that first point, just to sort of um, amplify, I suppose, the message here is that conflict and confrontation is inevitable, and it's something that we shouldn't look to stamp out. One of the challenges when I talked earlier about self-managed teams, one of the challenges of self-managed teams is that if you have a team without a designated manager or leader, one of the one of the potential risks is that people don't address conflict because there's no confidence that there's any arbitrator to resolve the conflict. So you end up seeing a lot of conflict and disputes not addressed. So it just manifests it just bubbles under the surface, and it manifests itself in things like passive aggressive decision making, or people being locked out of information sharing, or just things not getting done. Uh, so you won't see it in that sense. And when conflict is when destructive conflict occurs within a team, you'll see things like drop in productivity and so forth. As a manager and a leader, though, you want to have a degree of positive confrontation and conflict in your team, because conflict is essential to getting great ideas. Where one team member comes up with a baseline suggestion, then someone else will challenge an element of it in a respectful, in an inclusive, in a considerate way. They will challenge some concepts of it and perhaps look to build on that, and then another team member will do so, and we'll have a discussion that goes back and forth. And through that process of challenging ideas, we'll hopefully come up with one that we all agree upon, that has a little bit of everybody in it, um, and that is going to be the best outcome for us. But we wouldn't have got to that if everyone in the team was frightened to challenge anybody else's suggestion. So conflict and confrontation is really important, but it needs to be done in a constructive, respectful, inclusive way that is sensitive to everybody's uh, um perspective, everybody's diversity, and everybody's feelings as part of that. So that's not to say that we don't want to have conflict, but we want to do it in a way that's constructive rather than destructive. So all those other points I just mentioned, such as having a good culture and having good systems and procedures and so forth, they're all part of that. If you've got a good set of rules about what's the way that we communicate and what's the way that we share ideas, that we don't ridicule other people, that we don't make them feel, put them down, that we don't have personal attacks and so forth, people are going to have more confidence to share ideas, and then people are going to have more confidence to be able to challenge those ideas in a way that recognizes the positives out of it, but is constructively adding to it. So that's a really important component, and one that many leaders make the mistake of trying to stamp out conflict. And what ends up happening is that you just don't see a robust, respectful challenging of thoughts or work processes.